Hey pals, welcome back to a new video. Now, I love doing game jams, and last year in October, I actually entered into Ludum Dare with an engine that I'd never really tried before. And recently, I was approached by GameMaker to see if I'd like to do the same in their engine. Now, actually, GameMaker was the first engine I ever used in 2006 in the early years of high school, and a person born then would now be old enough to drink. So it's been a while, and I'm sure some changes have been made. I know that GameMaker has actually updated their licensing in the last little while, and so you can now download it for free. There's an affiliate link below if you're interested in checking out GameMaker after watching this video, meaning this is a sponsored video. And of course, being a sponsored video, you should filter through any of the opinions that I give with that knowledge, though I did ask the GameMaker team if I could be honest with my opinions through this experience, and they said yes. So I've done my best to be as honest as possible, and we'll just see what I say about the engine. So in this video, because I stream and record everything, we're going to be watching the first 2 days of me learning GameMaker, and then covering the 48 hours of me entering the jam and submitting my game, then a reflection on the game and my thoughts on the engine itself. Okay, let's get straight into it. So here we are in VLC. We're watching a VOD now of my stream. And one of the first things I did was, of course, download GameMaker. I had kind of like a package of, tutorial assets that I was going to be kind of looking through. And of course, GameMaker has a bunch of template kind of games that it comes with. So my goal here was basically just to consume as much content as I could about the engine from as many different places as possible. So here we're actually watching a video by a YouTuber, SarahJS, and they have this really awesome channel where, at least in this video, they're explaining how to use GameMaker at like this blistering pace, building Pong basically in like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So I just like turned that video on, put it at like 1.5x and just like soaked up all of the knowledge, which was actually really, really valuable as a way of learning for me. When you have a project framework, then you understand the motivations for why those things exist. Whereas if you just read a manual like end to end, yeah, the context isn't really there, so it's hard to remember everything. Whereas here it's like, oh, that's where you make a sprite. Oh, that's how sprites relate to objects. Like, it makes perfect sense. My first impression was basically how much of a unique ecosystem it is. It has this really interesting kind of workspace system where overlaid onto your interface when you're in like your scene editor or anything like that, you basically have these windows that pop up like inside of the application. And the windows have this kind of flow diagram layout where wherever you click on a property, that property then opens up, next to the window. So you've kind of got this cascading set of windows that contain the properties. At the top level, everything in the game that you put into like a room is kind of like an object. An object has a sprite, it has a collider, it has variables that you can add to it that are accessible from the script. And it also has events. So having those things like right off the bat is kind of interesting, and being able to access them from the editor here without having to add them in will definitely make it easier for kind of like beginners to get into things. And this kind of like workspace system goes as far as including like a sprite editor and like a code editor. Rather than having your like editor application and then your code application, your IDE, instead in GameMaker, everything is just in the one place. It's all kind of like visually splayed out, and I definitely found this a little bit intimidating at first, but then eventually I kind of understood the like flow diagram of what I was being shown left to right, and I started to digest things a little bit better. As far as code goes, GameMaker is very event-driven. So you have your objects, they have events. Those events are templated out by the engine. So things like onCreate, step, which is your like update loop. And then you have like collision with specific objects. All of that stuff is kind of made for you out the gate when you create an object. And then when you click on the event, it opens up an editor and you just write the code. Basically the body of the function, you just write that inside the editor for that event. So if you're making like really lightweight game objects, so, simple players, simple enemies, that kind of stuff, you don't even need to really define any functions. It's just it's all in the events. I then went through and made sure that I understood kind of a fair bit of the documentation. GameMaker's documentation is a little bit trickier than some of the other engines that I've used, mostly because a lot of the libraries of code are not really bound to objects or data containers or things like that. So if you want to modify an array, you don't say like array dot some function. There's like a function somewhere in the library of GameMaker that says, you know, array add, and required me to learn a lot of these function names off by heart. I was actually, you know, going in and playing some of these like boilerplate games that they've built. I kind of find this process a little bit harder than watching someone build something from scratch. When you're looking at a big project like this, it's kind of hard to know where exactly the logic lives. Seeing the like editor time view of the scene and then that looking kind of like nothing like the runtime view is another one of those confounding factors where it's like, I know that when I press play, it looks like a game, but back here, it just looks like a bunch of black boxes, which I don't know what they do. So I kind of didn't stay on this track very long because I didn't feel like I was learning that much that quickly. I mostly just stuck to YouTube tutorials and then kind of jumping into the engine and just playing around with stuff. So before long, I was like, hey, let's just do it. Let's just jump in, create a new project and make some objects and see what happens. So here you can see the workflow. It's pretty straightforward. Like you just make an object. The object has a sprite. If you haven't assigned one, you can create one. And then here you are in the sprite editor and you're already making the sprite for the object and it's already in the engine. So, you know, you could just jump in. In this case, I made a beautiful smiley face. This is my game character. And I'm doing a little bit of assessment here of the sprite editor. You know, I'm a sprite editor guy, being a big fan of ASprite. The functionality here is kind of, it's not ASprite level. It's kind of serviceable. This workflow of like create an object, throw a sprite on it, give it a little custom icon, and then just like move on was actually kind of cool. And what I wanted to explore here was just some of these foundational things that I use every day when I'm making games. So, you know, can I do some control input? Can I make the character move in 2D space? Can I give them a dash? How do I like just build out some stuff that I'm familiar with? So that's what I did. And before long, I had a little dude moving around, which was fun. So even things like input sanitizing. So if you press, you know, up and right, do you go faster than if you just go up? Trying to like figure out the best way to do normalization of vectors, understanding vector math in general, how it's done in GameMaker. And then, you know, things like simultaneous opposite direction stuff. So if I press right and left at the same time, do I go to the most recent direction or do I go nowhere? Doing those kind of routine things helped me get a sense of like, okay, how is this done in GameMaker? How are you expected to do things? I also wanted to try out like the engine's agility when it came to like switching between platforms. So how easy is it to port a game from Windows to HTML? How long does it take to render out, like to export and build an HTML game? How good is the debugging experience when you're making an HTML game versus a Windows game? It was something that was a little bit tricky, and I opted to kind of like build the game in Windows and then every so often kind of like switch over to HTML and see if anything broke. And in the jam, that was something that came up a little bit, but wasn't too much of an issue. I also did a brief little test with their timeline editor. Timelines in editors are like one of those, you know, pet little things of mine where I get really, really picky about them. In a video that I made about Godot, I criticized its timeline quite confidently. And I was actually really, really pleased to see that GameMaker has a very capable timeline editor with really, really clear keyframing and animation curve system, actually being able to have that be played within an editor and then use that in the game. That's something that I think is really important. And then like the long-term implications of like, could I make a cutscene out of this system? I was really impressed. I thought it was really nice. Just as a UX designer, I'm picky about it. I've built my own timeline in a different engine for my own purposes. So like, I was very happy with this. So by the end of the second prep day, I had this, you know, kind of 2D side-scrolling platformer setup. I wasn't confident that I would build a platformer for the jam, but I was confident that I'd learned enough about the engine and how to make stuff in it that I was happy with my knowledge. Beyond that, I didn't do any other prep. I just set up my prep document and then went straight into it. So let's cover jam day 1. So here is my working document for Ludum Dare 55. This is the final version of the document because obviously I've finished the jam. I put some like focus points in, so things that I want to remember, that I want to focus on as targets for myself, basically. Then I have like the days laid out. This jam started at 11 a.m. in Sydney time. So It started on Saturday, finished on Monday, 11 a.m. It's 48 hours, which meant actually it was really good for me. I could like get a good night's sleep before, spend all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and then if it came to it, not sleep Sunday night and then submit on Monday morning, which is what I did. So I'll show you the VOD. We'll jump straight into it. So here we are. It's the start of the jam. It's 11 a.m. and I'm looking at Twitter where the jam theme was announced, and the jam theme was summoning. So I went back to my document, filled in the theme title, and got to work. Basically, this started with just word association, just like, okay, what are the different things that you can summon or have anything to do with summoning? There was a really cool idea of like summoning things to court, a court summons, as opposed to summoning the dead or monsters. Now, we allotted, chat and I, allotted a fair bit of time to just thinking out mechanical ideas. We even thought about like a golf game where you like summon the ball towards you, like inverse golf. And then maybe there was an idea about like sort of a play on lemmings. So like summoning people to you to save them from monsters or dispelling monsters. And this kind of led to this idea. So there's a game that came out many years ago called Agar.io or Slither.io, Paper.io. There's a bunch of games, .io games that are almost like little battle royales that play in the browser. And you just jump into a room and everyone is an object and they're all trying to consume the other objects basically. And I thought, well, maybe we could do something that was like Agar.io, but like you are a wizard and all of the Agar things are demons. And you would basically dash around collecting resources, almost like Vampire Survivors-esque. You're picking up all the resources before the demons do, and then summoning bigger demons into existence to eat the smaller ones. And I liked this idea at first. I thought this was kind of workable, especially from this like top-down thing that I'd started with. And then just building out, a basic prototype. This is my strategy, right? You just build stuff. Don't polish anything until you know that it's going to stay in the game. You only have 48 hours, right? So you have to just build something, get it going, and then as you work, try to prioritize the things that are most valuable. So first I'm like spawning in the souls. I created like a little spawner script, and then having collision, so having them just delete on collision. It's pretty straightforward. And then incrementing an integer that said how many souls you have every time you step on one. And then one thing that I'm really picky about with these kind of things is having like there be magnetism. So if you get near a soul, actually having it like suck towards the player, especially in like a high intensity action game, which I thought this was going to become. I thought that was really important. So I added that, and you can see here that works. As you get closer to them, they kind of like hoover up near the player. A lot easier to collect a lot more of them without having to increase the size of the player. Then being able to shoot them out, and then trying to make the monsters grow. Although not always right the first time, but eventually I got it going pretty quickly. It wasn't too hard. Here's me just making sure that the object is pivoted to the center so that it scales from the middle, and then just making it kill the player on collision and then making it run towards the player. So pretty straightforward enemy AI, but I was going to make these monsters obviously run away from each other depending on their size, and eat each other, and sometimes eat up the souls and sometimes eat up the player. So I needed to create a little bit of behavior, though I didn't want to go so far as to create a state machine for this game. So a lot of this stuff is kind of like just in if statements, which is not long-term a great solution for this kind of thing. But for a jam, you only have 48 hours. It's kind of easy to just hack stuff in and make it work. A little bit of like debug UX here, actually just coloring the monsters based on their intentions. So when they're chasing the player, they go red. If they're chasing souls, they go green. You can see at this point, 1, 2, 3.5 hours spent on enemy AI. With a game like this, especially when you have only one other kind of entity in the game, they are more than half the game. So getting that right seemed like it was important. Maybe there were other versions of the game where I could have made different kinds of enemies that were each less capable, but more unique, right? Maybe that would have given me a bit more opportunity to make it more visually diverse. But you never know these things until you finish. So towards the end of the first day was putting some more of that UX in and finishing that game loop. And I started working on killing enemies and how that works into the gameplay loop. So the idea that I had was that when a demon monster dies, its kind of like skull drops to the ground, and then you could pick that up. So basically like the enemy becomes an item for the player to collect a bunch of souls all at once. I also started to experiment with the summoning mechanic. So basically you could hold right click and then a summoning kind of sign would appear. And then when you let go of right click, a demon appears of the size of the summoning sign. So you can create a little demon by holding it a little bit, or you can make a really big one by holding it a long time. But it would all depend on how many souls you had in the bank. Then just having the camera follow the player. I really wanted there to be almost a little bit of a horror element to this, where like you couldn't see all of the enemies at once. And, zooming the camera in was a really effective way to do that very quickly. There was this moment at kind of like the end of the first day where I was feeling like, as I was playtesting the game, there was something missing. Like you could make enemies that were bigger than the biggest enemy on the screen, and then eventually they would turn on you. But then how do you like clear the room? It's like that story about, what is it? The old woman that swallowed the fly or something, where like, they're getting bigger and bigger things in to chase the smaller things, and it just scales to infinity. So I was like, how would I make this something where you could actually like destroy the demons without increasing the economy of the room? And then an idea came to me of making like a ward, or like an exorcism ring, which I thought was really cool. But it seemed like an additional mechanic. So the idea would be that you'd place candles down in a ring, and then if you place the final candle, closing the ring off with a demon inside of it, you could like kill them in one go. You could just like destroy them. I thought this was like a really cool idea. I wasn't sure if I could do the math for the shape detection to see if they were inside or outside the shape. And I wasn't sure if it was going to be fun, but it did feel kind of neat conceptually. It felt good as an idea. So I was going to call this the ward mechanic. And that was the end of the first day. I did a little bit more plotting in just to make sure that, now that I knew kind of what the game was, I was like, okay, now let's make sure we have a couple of hours for UI, a couple of hours for music. So that was the end of day one. Let's go check out what happened on day two. Okay, so it's the start of day two, and I did a quick recap of like the game that we're making. Basically, this was the beginning of me having a little bit of chafing with the GameMaker sort of system. I really liked doing code in VS Code because I'm so comfortable writing there, and I really wanted to make use of some of the editor features that I like from there, but it really doesn't like you doing that. Basically, GameMaker creates a script for every function, every event handle, for every object. So every object was a folder and every function was a script, which is kind of a bit off kilter to how I'm used to doing stuff. It also meant that having to search through the files quite often to find what I was looking for, like which function I needed to place something in, was a little tricky. And then just writing some code to create the ward. At this point, it occurred to me that there was actually a solution for the shape thing that I had remembered hearing about many, many years ago. There is a test you can do to determine if a point is inside a shape. You have an object. From that object, you cast a ray in any direction. It could be, north, south, east, west, anywhere. As long as the length of the ray is larger than the total size of the shape that you'll need. So as big as the room, for example. And if the ray crosses over one of the edges of the shape, an odd number of times, you are inside the shape. If it crosses over an even number of times or no times at all, you are outside of the shape. There's no like area calculation, anything like that. You literally just count how many times it crosses over. For every edge, does the ray pass through it? Checking to see if two line segments overlap is not complicated. So this is me sort of demonstrating what that is. This is me figuring it out on stream. So you can tell, from this point here, like, okay, cross once, cross twice, cross three times. That means we're inside the shape. It was not complicated at all. And yeah, it totally worked. It was actually like really cool and really fun almost immediately. So the way that I ended up trying to balance this was, I would say, okay, depending on how far you are from the previous candle, when you go to place another one, that increases the cost of souls required to place that next candle. So you couldn't just make a giant rectangle the size of the whole level. You had to ration how big the thing was going to be. And also you had to fend off the monsters while trying to create the circle, which was cool. And at this point, I hadn't thought of it yet, but eventually I would make it so that the whole game was like operating on a single resource. So like the souls were the player's health. They were the way that you slow down enemies. They were the resource for how to create the wards. And I would represent that by like a bar along the top, which would shrink as you spend them. Then I wanted to dedicate time to creating like a mock-up for the game, just to create the graphics. So I thought it would be interesting to start a new palette for this game, just because I knew that thematically it was so different from what I normally make. So starting with blue and then sort of like building out towards a green or a yellow or a red. And before long, I had like a pretty nice palette that I was really happy with. Put it into Aseprite and then like use the ink dropper to just grab all those colors. And then I just started like drawing like a mock-up. So this is just like how I want the game to feel when you're playing it. I had this idea of like purple smoke and this kind of like off gray, cobblestone graveyard feel. And then I would use like white for all the interactable elements just to keep it really simple and straightforward. And then I would use color for different things. So like green for the souls, and then like red for monsters. And I ended up with something like this. So I was really hoping that I could wrangle GameMaker's particle system to play nice with this kind of presentation. But I was pretty happy with how this looked. Like I thought, oh yeah, if the game looks like this, that's great. This actually was one of the kind of hitches whenever you're working on a new engine or solution. If you don't know what you don't know, then there is always the chance that something's going to trip you up. Particle systems were that for me. I found GameMaker's particle system to be a little underdeveloped for what I would like. In other engines for particles, you can do things like define a behavior of a specific parameter over the particle's lifetime. In GameMaker, you only have one property that can modify the size of something over a lifetime, and it's not over its lifetime, it's just per frame. So it's like an increment value. So it could be like size increase by 0.001 every frame, or decrease by 0.001. But you can't make it like specifically be this size in the middle of its lifetime, or change directions halfway through. But for me specifically, I really wanted it to start small, get bigger, and get small again. And I spent quite a long time trying to do that. Mostly because if you start small and end small, then the birth and death of particles is less obvious. It doesn't pop. You can do that with alpha and size, and it will feel very ethereal, right? It won't feel as bursty. You can see here, like it almost feels like they're bubbles that are popping. I really didn't want that. I wasn't able to solve this within the parameters of the jam, so I sort of had to just deal with it. We spent like way too long on particles. It was like 2.5 hours. I got distracted. I overcommitted. I should have moved on, but it was such an important part of not only the enemies, but the walls. I wanted the surrounds to be like smoke and fog, the edges of the level. And I was even thinking of having there be like interactable fog. So like having the level be full of fog that clears away as you pass through it. I thought that would be cool. But the fact that it took me 2.5 hours to just get something in there was like, So I had to kind of move on to put the mock-up art into the game. One thing that's kind of a little tricky with GameMaker is it doesn't have a hierarchy. So you can't have like a particle system that's pinned, as a child object to an object. Instead, you have to set the position of an emitter every frame to equal the position of the thing that it is supposed to be attached to. Here I'm just making like level modules that I could just place in the scene to just vary up the background. And then I just stamped them into the level just to create some variation. At this point, the only way to destroy a demon inside of the ward was to lead the demon out and then run to the other side of the ward and then seal it off as they run towards you, just because they're following the player. And the way that you terminate the ward is to be standing back at the start candle. So here you can see me like leading it back and then quickly running over and then closing it off. So that was like a little bit limiting. The strat was like consistent and not that creative. Like you always had to do the same thing every time. And somebody said, hey, like, why don't you make the ceiling of the ward attached to a separate button so that you don't have to stand back at the original? And I was kind of resistive to that at first, but eventually I was like, you know what? That's probably the right idea. But it was difficult to kind of determine how we would now take all of the things you could do in the game and bind them to a really like straightforward key mapping. So at this point in the game, we have running around, WASD, spacebar to dash. We have left click to fire souls, right click to summon demons, and then shift to place candles. In order to make it be remote, detonatable, I would need to have like a separate keybind for closing the ward versus placing the candle, which meant in order to keep it mouse and keyboard and pretty straightforward, I ended up having shift be like a mode switch. So with this new model, I had shift be like the mode switch, and then the mouse buttons are place candle with left click, close ward with right click. That was the way that I ended up doing it. This felt tough. That was kind of like a little asterisk that I probably should have been more aware of. But at this point, we're sort of like getting quite late in the jam. So I didn't have a lot of time to rethink the game's core structure. But I really liked this mechanic, and I really wanted to persist with having there be wards. I didn't want to take it out, and having them be fun and creative. At this point, we're at like 9 p.m. on Sunday, which means if I'm going to do any more, I have to pull an all-nighter. So I just took a break, ended the stream, and prepared for the final push. So I started this stream by having there be just like a little bit more interactive procedural stuff around the player character. I wanted the staff to move relative to the mouse position on screen. So if the mouse goes to the left, I wanted it to move to the left. If the mouse goes to the right, I wanted it to move to the right, just to make it feel more animated, because right now it was just like a static sprite. And that was not too hard. Same principle as how I did the hands for the monsters. And then I just thought I would get out of the way the idea of like giving the game a name and giving it some sort of a brand. So that started with the title screen. I had this idea for the name Reaver, like Soul Reaver, almost like Reaper. It felt good. And we very quickly had this idea of like, what if the staff was a scythe? What if it's a little bit more like that? And that was cool. But eventually we had this really cool idea of having it be the skull, the goat skull. And I thought that was really cool. So I kind of ran with that idea. And that was the kind of logo for the game. Then there was just a bit more like prototyping stuff that I wanted to get done. So here I've got the skulls disappearing after a certain amount of time just to create more challenge. It forces the player to explore the level a bit more. If a monster gets killed by another one off screen, you only have like 10 seconds to go and find that skull and pick up all the souls. Having the game be balanced is just like the only thing about the game that there was to design, because there weren't any like story aspects or like different levels. It just needed to be a really tight loop. So I spent a lot of time on that. And then came music. Music is one of those things that I rarely get to spend a lot of time on in a jam. So I was like, you know what? Let's spend like 2 hours minimum on music. And I was actually, looking back on it, pretty happy with what I came up with. So this is just one of those areas where on stream, it's probably not the most fun thing to listen to, but this was the stream for like 2 hours. Halftime. That's what we ended up with. It wasn't finished, but for what it was, I thought it was serviceable. For a jam entry. I'm not a rock composer, so whatever. So I found this thing called OSEN Audio, which is kind of like a better Audacity, and this thing was great. This was like a really, really nice application, and would allow me to like record a bunch of sound effects, select the takes that I wanted without having to recut them, and then just export the selection to MP3. So that was like really, really easy as a workflow to just go like dunk, 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 export. And I just did mouth sounds for everything. Demon sounds, it was like, like whatever. There was this sound effect that went wong. I don't know what it was supposed to be. I think I was like wong for when you like plant a ward. And I think I might have just accidentally made the pitch range like too high. And so, I don't know, chat ran away with this thing where we were just every 5 seconds it was wong. And I left it in because, for the memes. So at this point, things were getting like a little bit dicey. We had like maybe 6 hours left, 7 hours left. So I was like, we'll make like a task list of just like things that are high priority to do before the end of the jam. So here I made a particle system for each of the walls to act as the smoke, and then little things like getting invulnerable when you get hurt, flashing when you take damage, and then when you dash, having there be a little bit of an after image of the player. And then we added a vignette. So this is like when you take damage and you're low on health, because it was possible to actually decrease your health by placing down a ward, because the souls that you have are your health and they're your resource. So I wanted a way to indicate to the player that they were bringing themselves close to death without having taken any damage from enemies. We made it basically just start transparent and big and then shrink to make it come in around the level and be more opaque the less health you have. So that actually like totally worked. And then there were a few more quality of life things that I wanted to add. Because we had the wards closing remotely, I had like a green indicator that showed if you had enough souls to press shift right click to close the ward. Because if you didn't have enough souls and there wasn't any indicator, it would just be like, you'd be like, why isn't it closing? So I added a little green flash, then adding a title screen, obviously, and a game over screen, and then basically just putting in some sort of tutorial to allow the player to understand how to play the game. This probably should have been an in-game tutorial. That would have been the right way to teach the player how to play this game. But I had like a couple hours left at this point and I didn't want to get it wrong. So I basically created like a little slideshow. When the game starts, you just click through it to learn the mechanics and then the game starts. It was only really at this point that I realized that the game was kind of complicated to get into. Like there's actually a lot of stuff that the player needed to understand, which is never a great sign for a jam. Only now can I say, looking back, having like made the whole game, that ward system could have been the only mechanic. We probably didn't need to be able to shoot souls out or even summon monsters. As long as they summoned themselves, that would fit the theme. And then dispelling them could have been the only mechanic. And it probably would have been easier to do and more fun. And hindsight is 2020. It's 2024 now. No more time for hindsight. That was 4 years ago. So at this point, we're basically finished with the game. Just need to export it to HTML5 and get it out of there. So by the end of it, we actually submitted in the final hour. We had like the entire submission hour to just like write up the title page and get screenshots and record a little GIF of gameplay. So let's review the final game loop and then we'll do our impressions. I should mention the jam itself is not over. So the voting is still on. People who entered the jam can actually like play the game and still give their thoughts. And I don't know how the game will do. We'll talk about that in the next section. But this is what we've got. So given that the jam voting period is not over yet, I don't really know if the game's going to do well or not. That's up to the voters. But for now, we can give our impressions and we'll also give our thoughts on GameMaker. Let's check it out. So of course, looking at the total thing, I would give myself like maybe like a 6.5 to like a 7 out of 10 in terms of my ability to navigate the process of making the game in the jam. I had a decently good idea at the start. The lead was pretty good at the beginning, but I think that during this first like 7-8 hours of like investing myself into building the core systems, I lost a little bit of that oversight that I needed in order to pivot effectively when eventually the like fun presented itself. So at the end of the first day, the idea of putting the wards in the game should have replaced some of the other mechanics rather than being added to them. I think a lot of the struggles that I had in the sort of later part of the jam, a lot of that had to do with the fact that I had so many different mechanics and trying to like fit them all in a way that felt nice. If I'd simplified the game, it would have been simpler to explain and I would have had a bit more space to play with either more polish or different kind of like level ideas, you know, stuff like that would have been more possible if the game was a little simpler. So finally, we can talk about the game in the context of GameMaker and what I think about GameMaker. So the biggest thing that stuck out to me when using GameMaker was that my personal workflow for how I build games and the models that I use to think about logic and structure, my games and the functionality isn't really how GameMaker expects users to use it. Particularly things like not being object-oriented or having composition, not having hierarchies in the actual room editor, not being able to pin things to other things. The way that the objects work and object definitions, how accessible they are with code, how you create them and modify them, and how you access events and script with them. The fact that it's handled for you and is by default standardized across the board makes GameMaker very accessible as an entry-level programmer. Learning it in GameMaker for the first time would be really, really quick and easy, but extending that stuff out with more powerful custom systems would take more time. So I'd have to spend some time building my own systems and getting more familiar with basically the coding paradigms that GameMaker expects, the more functional procedural stuff rather than the object-oriented component-based stuff. There are things that I really like about GameMaker, just flat out benefits over other engines that I've used. So the first thing that I really like is that the game's tick rate is standard. So if the game is a 60 FPS game, if you set that, that's the rate that the graphics run at, it's the rate that the physics collisions run at, everything is running at 60. I really like that. Other engines have fixed time, which is separate from graphics time, and then other time scales that are at play. This, you don't have to think about that. Secondly, the actual world scale is also very standardized in GameMaker. So one unit in game space is 1 pixel. If you move something over by 1, you're moving it over by 1 pixel, which is really cool for pixel art games, right? You don't have to think about the pixels per world unit ratio. You don't have to think about how big is this sprite going to be on screen. I also really liked how fast it was to compile. It was a super lightweight build. You could press a button, 5 seconds later, you have an HTML build of your game. Press a button, 5 seconds later, you have a Windows build of the game. Compared to other engines, you know which ones I'm talking about, that can be, for an HTML5 build, 20 minutes, half an hour per build, which is way, way more than you would expect in the context of a jam when you've got 5 minutes to finish. You don't want to spend 20 minutes waiting for the thing to build. So I really like that about GameMaker as well. I also really, really liked when you have a definition of an object, like an enemy type. So in the code, you can just say, hey, with this enemy type, do something. And it will literally iterate through every enemy that happens to be in the scene without you having to go and find a collection of those things. You don't have to do any kind of search or management of the instances of specific things inside of a scene. The fact that all the instancing is handled for you and the collections of those things are handled for you is really nice. Really, really nice. Of course, I like the sequencer, the animation editor, really, really cool. I haven't seen much of its tile support, although I believe that it would be quite rudimentary compared to what I'm used to. But that's to be expected. So overall, I really think that if you are a specific type of developer making a specific type of game, entry-level kind of developer making a sprite-based or a pixel art game, then GameMaker will offer you a lot of things out of the box that make that process very easy. My take on it is this: you can make anything in any engine you want, as long as it's Turing complete. You can make anything in it, right? You can make games in Minecraft if you want. But all engines are designed to do some things better than others. And when that happens, other things that you might want to do that fall outside of the scope of that design might become more difficult. So those are my impressions of GameMaker after about a week of use over the Ludum Dare jam and the days before. This is not a review video, this is more of an impressions. And so if you're curious about getting into GameMaker and seeing if it's right for you, you can actually download GameMaker for free now with a non-commercial license and just tool around and play with it. And if you actually use GameMaker, then I'd be super jazzed to hear your thoughts on your experiences and any tips that you have for making the most out of the engine. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.